I'm Sarah. I turned 28 this year. And during this past holiday season, my relatives discovered I wasn't the disappointment they'd been whispering about behind closed doors for nearly 3 decades. When my mother raised her wine glass that evening and declared to everyone present that my sister had recently purchased a stunning home, I already sensed this gathering would end in disaster. The roast was still warm, steam rising from the perfectly carved slices on the antique platter my grandmother had passed down, when she leaned forward in her seat, speaking loud enough for the entire room to witness, saying, "Your sister recently acquired this gorgeous property in Riverside Heights. When are you going to finally get serious about life?" My sister Jessica didn't even attempt subtlety. She grinned smugly over her third cocktail of the evening, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light from the chandelier, and chimed in with that condescending tone she'd perfected over the years. "Exactly, Sarah. When will you stop being immature and organize your existence? You're almost 30, for crying out loud." The dining area fell silent, except for the soft jazz playing from the speakers and the distant hum of the dishwasher. Everyone expecting me to brush it off with my usual nervous laughter, maybe make some self-deprecating joke about my apartment or my single status. This time I simply smiled. Not my typical polite expression they'd grown accustomed to over the years, the one I'd practiced in mirrors as a child, hoping it would earn me even a fraction of the attention Jessica received effortlessly. But the serene smile someone wears when holding knowledge nobody in that space deserves to hear. I gazed directly at my mother, noting how her confident expression wavered slightly when she saw something different in my eyes, something she hadn't seen before, and stated with quiet certainty, "I've already accomplished that. I simply didn't include anyone who questions my abilities." Lum. Her complexion turned crimson so rapidly it was almost comical, the color creeping up from her neck to her hairline like spilled wine, and every utensil froze midway to every mouth as they stared at me like witnessing me for the very first time. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by someone's sharp intake of breath and the gentle clinking of ice in Uncle David's whiskey glass. If you believe that single statement appeared randomly, you're mistaken. It was constructed from years of being overlooked, discounted, and measured against a favored child I could never surpass, no matter how hard I tried, no matter what I accomplished. That sentence was built on a foundation of countless small humiliations, missed opportunities, and the gradual realization that in my own family, I would always be the supporting character in someone else's story. Follow me to the conclusion, and I'll demonstrate how the overlooked daughter purchased her own property with cash earned through years of silent determination, transformed holiday dinner into a moment of truth that shattered decades of carefully constructed illusions, and ultimately departed from relatives who never believed she measured up to their impossible standards. That Christmas table was merely the closing scene of a much longer story, the final act in a drama that had been building for years. The narrative actually began years earlier in a peaceful neighborhood outside Denver, in a 2-story colonial house with white shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn, where my mother, Patricia, determined early who the family's star would be, and it was never me. The house itself seemed to reflect this dynamic, with Jessica's room on the 2nd floor overlooking the garden, spacious and bright with 2 large windows, while mine was tucked away at the end of the hall, smaller and darker, facing the neighbor's fence. My elder sister Jessica is 4 years my senior, and from the moment I could understand family dynamics, it was clear she occupied a different tier entirely. She was the firstborn, the beautiful one with naturally blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, the natural entertainer who could command a room's attention simply by walking into it. If there was a space, Jessica understood how to enter it like approaching a stage, every movement calculated for maximum impact. She had this way of tilting her head when she laughed, this musical quality to her voice that made adults lean in closer, hang on her every word. Even as children, strangers would stop my mother in grocery stores to comment on Jessica's beauty, her charm, her obvious intelligence. My father, Michael, labored extended hours as a civil engineer for Morrison & Associates, constantly buried in some project involving bridge constructions or highway expansions, always facing impossible deadlines that kept him at the office until well past dinner time. His home office was filled with blueprints and technical manuals, the smell of coffee perpetually lingering in the air from the pot he kept brewing throughout his rare work-from-home days. Therefore, most daily parenting responsibilities fell to my mother, a former elementary school teacher who had given up her career when Jessica was born and never quite gotten over the sacrifice. And my mother made it agonizingly obvious that Jessica was the protagonist while I was merely scenery, a supporting character meant to make Jessica look even brighter by comparison. This wasn't subtle or accidental. It was systematic, woven into the fabric of our daily lives in ways both large and small. When we went shopping, Jessica got to pick the restaurants, choose the activities, decide how long we stayed at each store. When friends visited, the conversation always centered around Jessica's achievements, her latest dance recital, her excellent grades, her growing collection of trophies and ribbons that lined the mantelpiece like a shrine to her success. I can still recall with painful clarity the year Jessica won a regional dance competition at the Denver Performing Arts Center. My mother went completely overboard, treating it like Jessica had just won an Olympic gold medal. She organized a massive celebration in our family room, transforming the space with golden balloons, streamers, and an enormous cake shaped like a trophy that must have cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. She invited what felt like half the neighborhood. Relatives drove in from surrounding states, and everyone gathered to take photographs of Jessica in her glittery costume, the plastic trophy gleaming in her small hands. My Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister who had always been the more practical one, kept expressing how proud she felt, though I caught her exchanging meaningful glances with her husband when my mother wasn't looking. Our cousin Emma, Helen's daughter who was only 2 years older than me, stood beside me near the refreshment table and whispered with the kind of brutal honesty only children possess, "This seems excessive for a plastic award that probably cost $5 to make." But my mother was absolutely beaming, radiant with pride, moving through the crowd like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations as if Jessica's victory was somehow her own personal achievement. That identical year, something happened that crystallized the dynamic in our household in a way I would never forget. I earned first place in a statewide writing competition for middle school students, beating out hundreds of entries from across Colorado with a short story about a girl who could hear the thoughts of abandoned objects. The certificate was beautiful, printed on heavy cream paper with gold embossing, and it came with a small scholarship for future educational endeavors. I remember running home from school, my backpack bouncing against my spine, so excited to share the news that I burst through the front door calling for my mother before I'd even dropped my books. There was no celebration, no balloons, no cake. My mother glanced at the certificate while she was preparing dinner, her hands still covered in flour from making homemade bread, and said with distracted casualness, "That's lovely, Sarah. But look at what Jessica accomplished today." She held up a photo of my sister in her dance costume, the same one from weeks earlier, like that single moment somehow outweighed anything I could ever achieve. The certificate ended up buried in a drawer somewhere, forgotten among old bills and expired coupons, while Jessica's trophy maintained its place of honor on the living room mantel. Moments like those never ceased throughout my childhood and teenage years, each one adding another layer to my understanding of where I stood in the family hierarchy. When I was 10 years old, we had planned a family camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park that I had been anticipating for weeks. I'd borrowed books about wildlife identification from the library, packed my own supplies in a small backpack, and even practiced setting up a tent in our backyard. The morning we were supposed to leave, bags loaded in the car, and hiking boots laced tight, my mother walked into my room with that particular expression that meant my excitement was about to be crushed. "We have to cancel," she announced with barely concealed irritation, as if the change in plans was somehow my fault. "Jessica needs a new dress for homecoming, and the sale at Nordstrom is today only," I suggested with the desperate optimism of a child who still believed fairness existed in our household. "We could go shopping after the camping trip, or maybe tomorrow when the stores open again." But she shut down my proposal with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation. "Your sister's needs are more pressing right now. The dance is this weekend and she has to look perfect. You'll understand when you're older." I never understood, even as I grew older, why Jessica's social calendar consistently took precedence over family plans, over my interests, over any consideration of what I might want or need. but I learned to accept it as the natural order of things, the way some children learn that the sky is blue or that fire burns. It was simply a fact of our family life that Jessica's desires would always outweigh my own. Another memory that still stings decades later occurred when I was 12 and had been preparing for months for a piano recital at the community center. I'd been taking lessons with Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 3 blocks away and taught piano in her living room surrounded by family photographs and the constant smell of jasmine tea. I practiced every day after school, my fingers growing stronger and more confident as I worked through Chopin's simpler pieces, determined to perfect every note, every dynamic change, every subtle expression marking in the score. The night of the recital, I wore my best dress, a navy blue one with tiny white flowers that my grandmother had sent for my birthday, and felt nervous but prepared as I took my place at the piano bench. The small audience of parents and grandparents settled into their folding chairs, programs rustling softly in the dim lighting. I searched the faces in the crowd, looking for my mother's encouraging smile, but her seat remained conspicuously empty. My father had called earlier to say he was stuck at work, an emergency with a bridge inspection that couldn't wait, but I'd assumed my mother would be there. I played my piece flawlessly, pouring months of practice and preparation into every measure, feeling the music flow through my fingers with a grace I'd never achieved before. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Mrs. Chen beamed at me from the side of the small stage, and I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. But the empty seat where my mother should have been sitting felt like a physical ache in my chest. Later that evening, I found out she had skipped my recital because Jessica had a volleyball game at the same time. An ordinary league game with no particular significance beyond the fact that Jessica was playing. When I asked why she hadn't come to hear me play, my mother explained with matter-of-fact certainty that made my heart sink. Your sister needed me more. The team is counting on having parents there for support, and you know how important volleyball is to Jessica's college applications. The logic was twisted but unshakable in her mind. Jessica's casual interests would always matter more than my serious accomplishments. It didn't matter what I did, how hard I worked, or what level of excellence I achieved. Everything I accomplished was somehow diminished, pushed into the background, treated as less significant than Jessica's most trivial activities. I was the quiet kid who loved books and journals, who spent afternoons in the library reading everything from classic literature to quantum physics, who wrote stories in notebooks I kept hidden under my mattress. I was the one who sat in corners during family parties while everyone gathered around Jessica, asking about her friends, her romantic interests, her plans for the weekend. During those gatherings, I became invisible, a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be worked around but was otherwise ignored. Relatives would ask Jessica detailed questions about her classes, her social life, her future plans, hanging on every word as if she were sharing state secrets. Meanwhile, if anyone acknowledged my presence at all, it was usually with vague, dismissive questions like, "How's school?" followed by distracted nods at whatever brief response I offered. After every family event, when the noise finally died down and the last relatives had driven home, Emma would seek me out with the loyalty of a true friend. She would find me in my room, usually reading or writing in one of my journals, and sit on my bed's edge, or join me on the back deck overlooking our small garden. "She has no clue what she's overlooking with you," Emma would say, with the kind of fierce protectiveness that made me feel less alone in the world. Her validation helped, providing a small buffer against the constant message that I wasn't quite enough, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality that within that house, I felt like a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. My mother was busy polishing Jessica's spotlight, ensuring it shone as brightly as possible, while acting like I should feel grateful just to stand nearby and bask in the reflected glow. Have you ever grown up realizing that within your own family you aren't the one they're supporting? That you're not the child they dream about or plan for or boast about to their friends? You're simply the one they expect to remain quiet and applaud for someone else, to smile and nod and never cause problems, never demand attention, never insist that your own accomplishments matter too. By the time I reached my late teenage years, the favoritism wasn't just about awards and attention anymore, though those patterns continued with exhausting predictability. It had evolved into something more concrete and damaging. the allocation of financial resources and opportunities that would shape our adult lives, the money that would determine which of us got to pursue our dreams and which of us would have to claw our way toward them alone. When Jessica completed high school with mediocre grades but an impressive collection of extracurricular activities that looked good on college applications, my mother, Patricia, orchestrated what felt like a royal coronation. She sat Jessica down at our kitchen counter with a carefully organized pile of brochures from Metro Community College, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she pointed to various programs and degree options. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting the enthusiasm in my mother's voice as she outlined Jessica's future. "We want you to remain close, darling," she said, with the kind of warm certainty I'd always longed to hear directed at me. "Community college is ideal for you. It will keep you stable and surrounded by familiar people, and we can make sure you have everything you need to succeed." What she actually meant, though she would never say it so directly, was, "I want you near me where I can continue managing your life and taking credit for your successes. Tuition, textbooks, transportation costs, meal plans, even spending money for social activities, everything will be covered." Jessica drifted through her college years like someone on a permanent vacation, bouncing between classes that interested her and parties that entertained her, joining clubs and dropping them when they became inconvenient, changing her major 3 times before finally settling on communications with a minor in theater arts. She treated her education like a social experiment, showing up when she felt like it and skipping when something more appealing presented itself. My mother called this approach exploring her options and building valuable relationships, framing Jessica's inconsistency as a sign of her adventurous spirit and natural curiosity. When my turn arrived 2 years later, the atmosphere in our household shifted dramatically. The supportive enthusiasm that had surrounded Jessica's college planning evaporated, replaced by a skeptical practicality that felt like a cold shower. I told my parents during dinner one evening that I wanted to attend Colorado State University to study digital marketing, explaining my fascination with the intersection of creativity and data analytics, how brands could tell stories through numbers, and build emotional connections through strategic communication. My mother barely glanced up from her phone, scrolling through Facebook posts while I outlined my carefully researched plans. "That's costly, Sarah," she said with the kind of dismissive tone usually reserved for discussing expensive luxuries we couldn't afford. "Perhaps you should consider something smaller, something more realistic." Community college worked perfectly well for Jessica, and look how happy she is. My father, Michael, mumbled something vague about scholarships and financial aid while gathering his briefings for another late night at the office, already mentally checked out from the conversation before it had really begun. And that was the end of their involvement in my educational future. Nobody sat me down with brochures or college guides. Nobody researched programs that might match my interests. Nobody promised to handle the financial burden or even help me navigate the application process. The message was clear. If I wanted more than what they had planned for Jessica, I would have to figure it out entirely on my own. So I went online and taught myself everything about college applications, financial aid, scholarship opportunities, and student loans. I spent hours in the school library, using their computers when ours was monopolized by Jessica's social media activities, filling out scholarship forms until my eyes burned and my wrists ached from typing. I applied for every scholarship I could find, from academic merit awards to essay contests to need-based grants, crafting personal statements and gathering recommendation letters from teachers who barely knew my name. I also secured a part-time job at Grind Coffee, a local cafe near the high school that catered to students and young professionals. I learned how to operate the espresso machine, memorizing the difference between macchiatos and cortados, how to steam milk to the perfect temperature and create foam art that would make customers smile. I mastered the art of taking orders from rude customers while maintaining a professional demeanor, cleaning equipment during slow periods, and completing homework during my brief breaks, balancing textbooks on milk crates in the storage room. The work was exhausting, especially during the school year, when I was trying to maintain my grades while earning money for college applications and future expenses. My hands smelled permanently of coffee grounds, my feet ached from standing for hours on end, and I often fell asleep over my homework late at night after closing shifts. But every paycheck, small as it was, represented independence and possibility, a step toward the future I was building for myself since nobody else seemed interested in helping. When my acceptance letter from Colorado State University arrived in a thick envelope that made my heart race before I'd even opened it, I felt a mixture of triumph and terror. The financial aid package was generous, but not complete, requiring me to take on student loans and continue working throughout college to cover the gaps. When I showed the letter to my mother, she glanced at it briefly and said with characteristic indifference, "Well, if they're paying most of it, then I suppose you can go. Just don't expect us to cover any extras." Jessica, meanwhile, continued her leisurely pace through community college, spending more time at parties and social events than in classrooms or libraries. She dated a series of guys who seemed to blur together in my memory, athletes and musicians, and aspiring actors who picked her up in loud cars and brought her flowers for no particular reason. Still, every time she passed a class or completed a semester, my mother celebrated as if she had just cured cancer. When Jessica finally finished her associate degree after 3 years instead of the traditional 2, having changed her major twice and failed several courses that she had to repeat, my mother organized a grand celebration at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown, with white tablecloths and wine lists that required a sommelier. She invited our extended family, ordered appetizers for the entire table, and made a lengthy toast about how proud she was of her firstborn daughter's determination and academic achievement. Emma and I sat at the far end of the table, clinking glasses of soda and sharing meaningful looks as my mother's praise flowed like the wine she was consuming with increasing enthusiasm. We listened to speech after speech about Jessica's potential, her bright future, her remarkable journey through higher education, all while knowing that Jessica had barely scraped by with the minimum GPA required for graduation. Several months later, when my acceptance to Colorado State University was followed by my successful completion of my first semester with a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore, the family response was notably different. I had walked across a stage in a cap and gown, heard my name called with distinction for academic achievement, felt the weight of every late-night study session and every double shift at work culminating in this moment of recognition. After the graduation ceremony, while my friends were taking group photos with their families, posing for pictures that would sit on mantles and fill photo albums, I checked my phone for messages from home. There was a brief text from my mother that felt like a form letter. "Congratulations, sweetheart. Your sister is overwhelmed at her new job. You should contact her and share all the details about your graduation. No dinner reservation, no celebration, no family gathering to mark the achievement I had worked so hard to reach. The contrast was so stark it would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful." Jessica's mediocre completion of a 2-year program earned a restaurant celebration with extended family, while my academic excellence and early graduation from a 4-year university merited a text message and the suggestion that I should call my sister to tell her about it myself. But the experience clarified something important for me, a realization that would shape how I approached the rest of my life. If I waited for my family to celebrate my achievements, to recognize my worth, to treat my successes as worthy of their attention, I would be waiting forever. They had constructed a narrative about who deserved support and recognition in our family, and I wasn't the protagonist of that story. So I stopped expecting them to rewrite it and started writing my own instead. After graduation, I moved into a tiny studio apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood, a space so small that my bed doubled as my couch, and my kitchen table served as my desk. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor's television and my next-door neighbor's morning alarm clock. The windows were old and drafty, letting in cold air and traffic noise throughout the winter months. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person, with a refrigerator that hummed constantly and a stove that required matches to light because the electric ignition had long since broken. But despite its limitations, that apartment was mine in a way that nothing had ever been before. I could decorate the walls with my own photographs, play my music as loud or as soft as I wanted, eat dinner at midnight or breakfast at noon, create a space that reflected my tastes and interests, instead of accommodating someone else's preferences. For the first time in my life, I was living in an environment where my choices mattered, where my comfort and happiness were the primary considerations. I secured an entry-level position at Meridian Creative, a small marketing agency downtown that specialized in helping local businesses build their digital presence. It was the kind of place where you learned by doing everything, because there wasn't anyone else available to handle the overflow. I managed social media accounts for restaurants and retail stores, wrote advertising copy for everything from furniture sales to yoga classes, generated monthly reports that tracked engagement metrics and conversion rates, and stayed late watching online tutorials about campaigns that had achieved viral success. My boss, David Chen, was a former corporate marketing executive who had started his own agency after getting laid off during a recession. He believed in throwing new employees into the deep end and seeing who could swim, which meant I was handling client calls and creating campaign strategies within my first month on the job. It was terrifying and exhilarating, the kind of professional trial by fire that either builds confidence or breaks spirits entirely. I lived on discounted groceries from big box stores, planning my meals around whatever was on sale that week, and learning to cook basic recipes from free apps and YouTube videos. I tracked every dollar in a detailed spreadsheet, categorizing expenses and setting aside small amounts for emergencies and future goals. My social life was minimal by most standards. Occasional drinks with coworkers, free events like museum open houses and outdoor concerts, movie nights at home with Emma when she visited from college. My mother called regularly during those early years, but the conversations always followed the same predictable pattern, circling back to Jessica like planets orbiting the sun. "Your sister just got promoted to assistant manager at that boutique," she would say with pride radiating through the phone line. "She's thinking about moving to a nicer apartment in Cherry Creek, somewhere with a pool and a fitness center. And did I tell you about her new boyfriend? He's in medical school. Very promising future." The few times I attempted to share details about my own life, my work projects or professional achievements, she would listen with polite distraction before redirecting the conversation back to Jessica's more interesting developments. "That's nice, dear," she would say in a tone that suggested she wasn't really listening. "But have you heard about Jessica's latest promotion opportunity? They're considering her for management training." After a few months of these one-sided conversations, I stopped offering detailed updates about my life. I let her assume I was just getting by, just barely keeping my head above water, maintaining the apartment and the job, but not really thriving or building toward anything significant. It was easier than trying to compete for her attention, simpler than watching her gloss over my successes to focus on Jessica's more captivating narrative. Instead, I poured all my energy into work, channeling the need for recognition and approval into professional achievement. If nobody at home was going to see my potential, I would make sure people in the real world did. I volunteered for the most challenging projects, stayed late to perfect presentations, studied industry trends and best practices during my lunch breaks. When your own family treats you like the backup plan, sometimes the only choice you have left is to become so successful on your own that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I just didn't realize yet how far that determination would actually take me, or how dramatically it would change the power dynamic in our family when they finally discovered what I had been building while they weren't paying attention. The turning point in my professional life came on a frigid January evening 3 years before that fateful Christmas dinner, back when I still harbored some hope that my mother might eventually notice my accomplishments. I had just completed my first truly major project at Meridian Creative, a comprehensive digital marketing campaign for Boulder Brew Company, a mid-sized craft brewery that wanted to expand their market reach among younger consumers throughout Colorado. The project had consumed my life for 3 months, requiring me to learn new software platforms, coordinate with graphic designers and videographers, manage a substantial advertising budget, and create content strategies across multiple social media channels. I worked nights and weekends, testing different messaging approaches, analyzing competitor campaigns, and refining our targeting parameters based on real-time performance data. My apartment became a secondary office, covered with printed analytics reports, mood boards, and timeline charts that tracked every aspect of the campaign's development. When the results came in 6 weeks after launch, they exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Online engagement had increased by 40%, website traffic had doubled, and most importantly, actual sales had jumped by 28% compared to the same period the previous year. The brewery's owner called our office personally to thank the team, And my boss David actually stood up and applauded when I presented the final metrics during our Monday morning meeting. "Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of smile usually reserved for major client victories, "this is the kind of work that gets people promoted and wins industry awards. You've basically created a template for how we're going to approach all our beverage clients moving forward." The recognition felt incredible, validating all the late nights and weekend sacrifices I'd made to ensure the campaign's success. I went home that week feeling like maybe, just maybe, I was finally building a career that mattered, creating a professional reputation that would open doors and provide the kind of financial security I'd been working toward since college. The promotion David had hinted at materialized 2 weeks later, along with a salary increase that finally allowed me to consider moving to a better apartment, and maybe even saving money for long-term goals, instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. So when my mother called and insisted I come home for the holiday dinner, using that particular tone that brooked no disagreement, I agreed without my usual reluctance. Part of me wanted to show her that I wasn't just barely surviving in the city, that I had built something meaningful and successful despite the lack of family support. Maybe I was still harboring that childish hope that she would finally be proud of me, that she would see my achievements as worthy of the same enthusiasm she showed for Jessica's most mundane accomplishments. The family home looked identical to my childhood memories, the same warm lighting that made everything appear softer and more welcoming than it actually was, the same aroma of my mother's cooking filling every room, the same feeling of walking into a space where I would always be a visitor instead of a true inhabitant. My mother moved around the kitchen like a general coordinating a military operation, directing traffic and managing multiple dishes with the efficiency of someone who had been hosting family gatherings for decades. Jessica arrived an hour late, naturally, sweeping in with a dramatic flair that made everyone turn to look at her entrance. She had recently gotten an expensive haircut that framed her face perfectly, new boots that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months, and a collection of work stories about her co-workers at the high-end boutique where she had been promoted to assistant manager. She embraced my mother first, holding the hug just long enough for everyone to witness their closeness, then gave me a quick, impersonal hug, like greeting a distant acquaintance rather than her sister. We gathered around the dining room table, plates piled high with my mother's traditional holiday meal, conversation flowing easily among the adults, while I mostly listened and observed. My Aunt Helen asked about my work with genuine curiosity, and for once, my mother didn't immediately redirect the conversation toward Jessica's more interesting developments. I took a deep breath and started to share some details about the brewery campaign, explaining how we had identified underserved demographic segments and created content that spoke directly to their interests and values. My cousin Emma's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as I described the strategic thinking behind our approach. "That's huge," she said, leaning forward with real interest. "That's like legitimate career development stuff, not just entry-level busy work. You're basically creating marketing strategies that other companies are going to copy." I felt a warmth spread through my chest at her recognition, the kind of validation I had been craving from my family for years. I laughed, feeling shy but genuinely proud as I continued sharing details about the project's success. I mentioned the bonus I had received, careful not to sound boastful, but wanting them to understand that my work was being recognized and rewarded in concrete ways. For several minutes, the entire table was actually quiet, everyone listening with what seemed like genuine interest and respect for what I had accomplished. Then, just as I was beginning to relax and enjoy the rare experience of being the center of positive attention in my family, my mother tilted her head with that particular smile I knew so well, the one that meant the spotlight was about to shift away from me. She turned toward Jessica and said with renewed enthusiasm, "Speaking of exciting developments, did everyone hear about Jessica's new car? She just got one of those luxury SUVs, a white one with leather interior and all the latest technology. She can drive to work in style now." The conversation pivoted away from me like a door slamming shut. My uncle asked about the model and its features. My aunt inquired about the monthly payments and insurance costs. My mother launched into a detailed description of the dealership experience and the generous financing terms Jessica had negotiated. I watched the spotlight slide off me and land right back where it always did, on Jessica and her latest acquisition, leaving me once again relegated to the audience instead of being the star of my own story. Emma shot me a look across the table that conveyed both sympathy and frustration, the kind of silent communication we had perfected over years of witnessing these moments together. Later that night, while we were clearing dishes and wiping down counters, my Aunt Helen cornered me in the hallway with that particular expression adults wear when they're about to offer unsolicited life advice. "Your mother just wants you to be happy," she said in the careful tone people use when they know they're about to say something that will sting. "Maybe you shouldn't focus quite so intensely on your career. Men want someone who can balance professional ambitions with family priorities. Jessica is really good at that balance. She's successful, but not intimidating. You don't want to make dating more difficult for yourself by being too career-focused." I stood there holding a stack of plates, listening to that familiar script that had followed me throughout my 20s. Work too hard and you're threatening to potential partners. Don't work hard enough and you're disappointing your family. Either way, I was always the one who needed to adjust, to modify my behavior and ambitions to make other people more comfortable. The message was clear. Jessica had found the perfect balance between achievement and femininity, while I was somehow doing it wrong by excelling too much in one area. On the drive back to my apartment that night, my mother insisted on riding with me, claiming she wanted to spend more time together but really wanting to deliver what felt like a prepared speech. The heater in my old Honda made a concerning rattling sound, and the city lights blurred past the windshield as she stared straight ahead and delivered her assessment of my life choices. "You know, your sister is really getting everything together," she said with satisfaction evident in her voice. "The new car, steady employment with advancement opportunities, a serious relationship with someone who has real potential. You should think about settling down too, Sarah. You're not getting any younger, and focusing so much on work might be sending the wrong message to potential partners." Something fundamental shifted inside me during that car ride. A quiet but permanent change in how I understood my relationship with my family. I realized I could spend the next decade chasing her approval, trying to prove my worth through professional success or personal achievements, and still end up having this exact conversation. I would always be compared to Jessica like we were competitors in some twisted contest I had never agreed to enter, my accomplishments measured against hers instead of being valued on their own merit. So I made a decision that night that would shape everything that followed. I stopped playing their game. I stopped providing detailed updates about my professional progress, stopped hoping for recognition or celebration, stopped trying to compete for attention I was never going to receive. Instead, I redirected all that energy into building the kind of life and career that would make their opinions irrelevant. At work, I doubled down on my commitment to excellence. If nobody at home was going to see my potential, I would make sure everyone in the professional world did. I volunteered for increasingly complex projects, took on additional responsibilities without being asked, and spent my evenings learning new skills that would make me more valuable to current and future employers. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to account manager, with my own clients and a team of junior associates to supervise. Over the next 2 years, I moved steadily up the ladder at Meridian Creative, transitioning from managing individual campaigns to overseeing entire client relationships and developing long-term strategic partnerships. I learned how to turn cultural trends into marketing opportunities, how to pitch million-dollar campaigns to corporate executives, how to lead creative teams and manage competing priorities and deadlines. Our agency landed several national brands during this period, and I found myself in meetings with marketing directors I had previously only read about in industry publications. My professional reputation grew beyond the agency as well. I started speaking at marketing conferences, writing articles for trade publications, and serving on panels about digital strategy and brand development. My LinkedIn profile attracted recruiters from larger agencies and corporate marketing departments, offering salaries that seemed almost fictional compared to what I had been earning just a few years earlier. But perhaps more importantly, I also started investing seriously in my financial future. While other people my age were posting photos from expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, documenting their social lives and consumer purchases on social media, I was putting substantial portions of my income into retirement accounts, index funds, and long-term investment strategies I researched obsessively during lunch breaks and weekends. I learned about compound interest and asset allocation, about the difference between growth stocks and dividend-paying investments, about how to build wealth slowly and systematically, rather than chasing quick profits or flashy purchases. I automated transfers from my checking account to various investment accounts, treating my future financial security as seriously as I treated my professional development. Meanwhile, Jessica continued her pattern of job hopping every 12 to 18 months, moving from the boutique to an administrative assistant position at a dental office, then to some kind of event coordination role that seemed to involve mostly planning birthday parties and baby showers for wealthy clients. Each transition was framed by my mother as evidence of Jessica's versatility and willingness to explore new opportunities, rather than signs of instability or difficulty maintaining long-term employment. The more my own life stabilized and grew more successful, the more clearly I could see the cracks in Jessica's carefully maintained image. She always had new shoes, new gadgets, fresh highlights in her hair, and photos from weekend trips to Aspen or Las Vegas. But somehow, she was constantly calling my mother for financial help, needing assistance with rent payments, car repairs, or credit card bills that had gotten out of control. My mother would sigh dramatically during these phone calls, complaining to anyone who would listen about how exhausting it was to help Jessica manage her finances. But the money always materialized somehow. Whether it came from my parents' savings account, my mother's retirement fund, or credit cards that my mother used to cover Jessica's emergencies, there always seemed to be a financial safety net available whenever Jessica needed one. I stayed quiet during these family dramas, watching from a distance and doing the math in my head. Jessica's lifestyle didn't match her income. Her spending patterns were unsustainable, and her approach to money management was essentially non-existent. But pointing out these obvious facts would only make me the villain in their story, the jealous sister who couldn't be happy for Jessica's success. Instead, I continued building my own life methodically and independently. I told myself it was none of my business how Jessica and my mother handled their financial relationship, that I had my own goals to focus on and my own future to secure. I only broke that rule of non-interference when my mother called with news that would eventually drag me back into their spotlight, whether I wanted to be there or not. She said Jessica was finally buying a house, and the whole family was getting together to celebrate this milestone achievement. The way she announced it, you would have thought Jessica was being awarded the Nobel Prize, rather than simply taking on a mortgage like millions of other adults do every year. But in my mother's narrative, this was proof that Jessica had truly grown up, that she was finally settling down and building the kind of stable, respectable life that every parent dreams of for their children. My mother turned Jessica's house news into a full-blown celebration before the mortgage papers had even been signed. A couple of weeks after that initial phone call, she sent a message to our family group chat in all capital letters, announcing a backyard barbecue to celebrate Jessica's pre-approval for a home loan. She made it sound like Jessica had just been selected for a space mission, rather than qualifying for a standard 30-year mortgage. When I arrived at my parents' house that Saturday afternoon, the scene looked like something from a real estate company's marketing campaign. There were balloons shaped like tiny houses tied to the fence posts, a large cardboard cutout of an oversized key propped up on the patio table, and a professionally made banner reading, "Congratulations, future homeowner," stretched between two trees in the backyard. My mother had even special ordered a cake decorated with a miniature house and garden, complete with Jessica's name written in elaborate script frosting. Jessica held court in the center of the gathering, a glass of wine in her hand, describing the property like she was giving a tour of Versailles, rather than discussing a modest 3-bedroom house in a suburban development. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a finished basement that could be a home office or entertainment room, and this adorable little yard that's perfect for hosting parties, she explained to anyone within earshot. Plus, it's only 20 minutes from downtown, so convenient for work, and the neighborhood has a community pool and playground for when I have kids someday. Every few minutes, my mother would interject with additional praise, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal pride that I had learned to recognize and simultaneously envy. "We're just so proud of her," she would announce to whoever happened to be nearby. "She's worked so hard for this, saved up for the down payment, found the perfect neighborhood. This is what real stability looks like." I spent most of the party hovering near the grill with my father, helping him flip burgers while he muttered complaints about interest rates and property taxes under his breath. His engineering mind couldn't help but focus on the financial realities that everyone else seemed determined to ignore, though he was careful not to voice his concerns too loudly when my mother was within earshot. Relatives drifted through various conversations throughout the afternoon. My Aunt Helen approached me at one point to ask if I was still living in that tiny apartment in the city, phrasing the question in a way that made my living situation sound like a temporary inconvenience rather than a deliberate choice. When I confirmed that yes, I was still renting in Capitol Hill, she smiled with that particular expression of pity and said, "Well, at least you don't have the stress of a mortgage payment yet. Must be nice not having any major financial responsibilities to worry about." I bit back several responses to that comment and took a sip of my watered-down lemonade instead, choosing to avoid the argument that would inevitably follow if I pointed out that I had been financially independent for years while Jessica was still receiving regular subsidies from our parents. Later in the afternoon, when most of the family had moved outside to take group photos with the celebration cake, I went into the kitchen to help with cleaning and to refill the ice buckets. That's when I overheard the conversation that would change how I understood Jessica's achievement and my mother's role in enabling it. My mother's voice carried from the dining room, low but with an urgency that made me pause and listen instead of announcing my presence. Jessica was sitting at the table with a thick manila envelope spread open in front of her, papers scattered across the surface like pieces of a complicated puzzle. My mother sat across from her, reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression serious as she reviewed what appeared to be financial documents. "I just don't understand how you're going to manage all these payments," my mother said, her voice tight with worry. "You've got 3 credit cards that are nearly maxed out, the car payment is $400 a month, and now you're taking on a mortgage payment of almost $1,800. Your salary barely covers your current expenses even with the raises you've gotten." Jessica sighed dramatically, the sound carrying the weight of someone who had been having this conversation repeatedly. "I know, Mom, but if I don't buy something now, I'll never be able to afford it. Property values just keep going up, and everyone my age is already homeowners. I can't be the only one still renting when I'm 30. You know how that looks to people." My mother rubbed her temples, a gesture I recognized from my childhood when she was trying to solve problems that seemed to have no good solutions. "How much are you short for the closing costs and down payment?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Jessica slid one of the papers across the table, pointing to a number that was highlighted in yellow. "Around 12,000, she said matter-of-factly, as if this was a minor detail rather than a substantial sum of money. "Maybe a little more if they don't waive some of the fees. I was thinking maybe you could take a loan against your retirement account again, just temporarily. Just until I get the promotion they've been talking about at work. Just temporarily. Just until." The same phrases I had heard Jessica use about homework extensions, overdraft fees, credit card payments, and car repairs throughout our adult lives. Always a temporary problem that required a permanent solution from my mother's savings. My mother was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear the mental calculations as she tried to figure out how to make this work without completely destroying their own financial security. "I'll see what we can do," she finally said with resignation. "Maybe I can put some of it on my credit card and we can pay it off gradually, just until you get established in the house and your income stabilizes." My stomach turned as I listened to this conversation, thinking about the night years earlier when I had asked my mother for a few $100s to help with a security deposit on my first apartment. She had lectured me about the importance of financial independence, about learning to stand on my own 2 feet, about not expecting family to bail me out when I made adult decisions. Yet here she was, preparing to raid her retirement savings to fund Jessica's irresponsible financial choices. I thought about every extra shift I had worked at the coffee shop during college. Every weekend I had skipped social activities to save money. Every time I had chosen generic groceries and thrift store clothes so I could build an emergency fund instead of living paycheck to paycheck. All while my mother was building a financial safety net for Jessica that would enable her to avoid facing the real consequences of her spending habits. I stepped back from the doorway before they could see me eavesdropping, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and clarity. A few minutes later, I walked into the dining room, acting as if I had just arrived from outside, and they both immediately shifted into performance mode, smiling brightly and tucking the financial documents back into their envelope like nothing significant had been discussed. My mother slipped the papers into Jessica's bag with practiced discretion, and they both rejoined the celebration on the patio where cake was being served and photographs were being taken to commemorate this wonderful milestone in Jessica's life. That night, driving back to my apartment through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, I opened my laptop and really examined my financial situation for the first time in months. I pulled up all my accounts, checking and savings, retirement contributions, investment portfolios, emergency funds. Years of disciplined saving, careful investing, and living below my means had accumulated into a sum that surprised even me. While my mother had been pouring money into maintaining Jessica's lifestyle and public image, I had been quietly building real wealth, the kind that could provide genuine security and freedom, rather than just the appearance of success. For the first time since I had started working full-time, the idea of buying my own house didn't feel like a distant fantasy. It felt like a mathematical possibility, something I could actually achieve without family help or financial stress. Within 2 weeks, I was meeting with Sarah Martinez, a real estate agent who specialized in properties around Boulder and the surrounding lake communities. We spent a weekend driving through different neighborhoods, looking at condos and townhouses that fit within my budget range, discussing the pros and cons of various locations and property types. Then we found it. A charming bungalow on the shores of Lake El Dorado, about 30 miles outside Denver. The house had been built in the 1960s and recently renovated by the previous owners, who had updated the kitchen and bathrooms while preserving the original character and charm. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an open-concept living area, and a small office at the back of the house that looked directly out onto the lake through floor-to-ceiling windows. The property had everything I hadn't even known I was looking for. No shared walls, no upstairs neighbors, no parking hassles or noise complaints. Just a peaceful view of water and mountains, a small deck perfect for morning coffee, and enough space to create a home office where I could work on freelance projects and maybe even start my own consulting business someday. The asking price made my palms sweat initially, representing more money than I had ever spent on anything in my life. But when I sat down with a financial advisor and we went through every aspect of my situation line by line, he said something that gave me the confidence to move forward. "You've done all the hard work already. You can definitely afford this, and you're in the unusual position of being able to pay cash if you want to avoid the headaches and uncertainties of mortgage approval." So I did exactly that. I liquidated investments I had been building for years, consolidated funds from multiple accounts, and arranged a wire transfer for the full purchase price. No loan applications, no credit checks, no family co-signers, no desperate phone calls asking for financial assistance. Just my own money, earned through my own work, invested wisely over years of disciplined financial management. On the day I received the keys to my house, I drove out to Lake El Dorado by myself and stood alone in the empty living room, listening to a silence I had never experienced before. No traffic noise, no arguing neighbors, no sounds of other people's lives bleeding through thin apartment walls. Just the gentle lapping of water against the shore, the rustle of wind through the trees, and my own breathing as I absorbed the magnitude of what I had accomplished. Emma was the only family member I told about the house initially. She drove out the following weekend with her car packed full of houseplants, a toolbox borrowed from her father, and enough enthusiasm to make up for the complete absence of family celebration. When she walked through the front door and saw the views, the space, the obvious quality of the renovation work, she immediately started grinning with the kind of pure joy that made me remember why she had always been my favorite relative. "Sarah," she said, walking from room to room with genuine amazement, "this is absolutely incredible. This place is like definitive proof that you were never the failure in this family story. You were just the one playing a completely different game than the rest of us realized." We spent that weekend assembling furniture I had ordered online, unpacking boxes of dishes and books and personal items that had been stored in my tiny apartment for years, and making multiple trips to home improvement stores to buy everything from curtains to lawn chairs. By Sunday evening, the house had been transformed from an empty property into something that actually felt like a home. At one point, Emma stood in the doorway of my new office, looking out at the lake view that would be my backdrop for video calls and creative work, and asked the question I had been expecting. "Do your parents have any idea about this place?" I shook my head without hesitation. "No, and honestly, I want to keep it that way for now. I don't want this turned into another opportunity for them to make it about Jessica somehow, or to find ways to diminish what I've accomplished here. For once in my life, I want something that's completely mine, untouched by their expectations or comparisons." I genuinely believed I could maintain that boundary, that I could let them continue living in their preferred narrative about who was successful and who was struggling, while I built my life quietly by the water. I thought I could exist peacefully in their blind spot, achieving my own version of success without having to defend it or compete for recognition. I had no idea that a single Christmas dinner just a few months later would drag everything out into the open, forcing a conversation I wasn't prepared to have, and revealing truths that would fundamentally change our family dynamics forever. Christmas at Jessica's new house was staged like a scene from a holiday lifestyle magazine. Every detail had been carefully planned to create the perfect impression. The living room draped in warm white lights that created a soft, festive glow. An enormous tree positioned in the corner with coordinated ornaments in gold and silver that caught the light beautifully. The entire house smelled like cinnamon and vanilla from candles strategically placed throughout the rooms, and Christmas music played at just the right volume to create ambiance without interfering with conversation. My mother, Patricia, moved through Jessica's kitchen like she owned the property, directing food preparation and managing the complex logistics of serving dinner to a dozen family members. She had clearly spent considerable time helping Jessica prepare for this event, and her pride in the house was almost as obvious as Jessica's own satisfaction with finally being able to host a major family gathering. I pulled up to the curb in my reliable but unimpressive Honda Civic, parking several houses down because the driveway and immediate street were already filled with relatives' cars. I sat for a moment before getting out, staring at the cheerfully lit house and trying to prepare myself mentally for what I knew would be several hours of familiar family dynamics played out in a new setting. Part of me seriously considered turning around, driving back to my quiet house by the lake, and spending the evening with Chinese takeout and my cat, Lucy, curled up on the couch while I worked on freelance projects or read one of the books I had been meaning to finish. But family obligations die hard, and I knew that skipping Christmas dinner would only create more drama and speculation than actually attending. I took a deep breath, grabbed the bottle of wine I had brought as a hostess gift, and walked up the driveway toward what I suspected would be one of the most challenging evenings I had spent with my family in years. Jessica opened the door wearing a red cashmere sweater dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her makeup applied with professional precision, her hair styled in the kind of effortlessly perfect waves that actually require considerable effort to achieve. She looked like she was posing for a Christmas card, the successful young homeowner welcoming family into her beautiful new space. She embraced me with the kind of light, careful hug designed to avoid messing up her appearance, then stepped back to give my outfit a quick but thorough assessment. "You look nice," she said with faint surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to dress appropriately for the occasion. "Kind of simple, but nice. Very Sarah." The comment was quintessentially Jessica, seemingly complimentary on the surface, but with just enough subtle criticism to make me feel slightly off balance. I had actually put considerable thought into my outfit, choosing a dark green dress that was festive without being flashy, but apparently, I had still somehow missed the mark in her estimation. Inside, the party was already in full swing. My Aunt Helen and Uncle David were settled on the new sectional sofa, drinks in hand, admiring the crown molding and built-in shelving that came with the house. Emma was leaning against the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, but looking up to give me a quick, knowing smile when she spotted me arriving. My father stood near the fireplace, examining the mantel construction with the professional interest of someone who understood how houses were built. My mother emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron over her best dress, her cheeks flushed from wine and the heat of cooking, radiating the kind of hostess energy that suggested she had been planning this evening for weeks. "Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, kissing my cheek with the enthusiasm usually reserved for distant relatives she hadn't seen in years, rather than her daughter who lived just an hour away. The dinner itself was elaborate in the way that family holiday meals often are, with far more food than any reasonable number of people could consume. The dining room table was covered with my mother's traditional holiday spread: an enormous turkey that had been brining for days, mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, green bean casserole with crispy onions on top, stuffing made from my grandmother's recipe, homemade cranberry sauce, and fresh rolls that filled the entire house with the smell of yeast and butter. For the first hour or so, I managed to fade into the background in my usual way, listening more than talking, answering polite questions about work and city life with deliberately vague responses that wouldn't invite follow-up inquiries. I had perfected this approach over years of family gatherings, participating just enough to avoid seeming antisocial, while not revealing anything that might trigger unwanted attention or comparison to Jessica's more interesting life developments. I was halfway through my second helping of my mother's famous stuffing, actually enjoying the food and the relative peace of being ignored, when everything changed with the sharp sound of a fork tapping against crystal. My mother stood up at the head of the table, her wineglass raised, her expression beaming with maternal pride as she prepared to make what was clearly a prepared speech. The conversation gradually died down as people noticed her intention to address the group, and soon the dining room was quiet, except for the soft Christmas music still playing from the living room speakers. "I just want to take a moment," she began, her voice carrying the slight breathiness that indicated she had been drinking wine throughout the cooking process, "to say how incredibly proud I am of my daughter Jessica." She turned toward Jessica with a smile so radiant it could have powered the Christmas lights. Buying this beautiful house, creating a real home, building a stable and successful life, this is exactly what we always hoped for, what every parent dreams of seeing their children achieve. She gestured around the room with obvious satisfaction, taking in the perfectly decorated space, the expensive furniture, the obvious signs of Jessica's apparent prosperity. "This is what real stability looks like," she continued, her voice growing more emotional with each word. "This is proof that hard work and determination pay off, that our children can build lives we can be truly proud of." Then, in what felt like slow motion, she turned her attention toward me, and I could sense the shift in energy before she even opened her mouth. The warmth and admiration in her voice cooled noticeably as her gaze settled on me, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next was going to be painful. "Your sister has bought this beautiful house, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying just a little too much emphasis, just a little too much volume for normal conversation. "When will you finally settle down and build something real with your life?" A soft ripple of discomfort ran around the table. A few people let out awkward laughs. Others suddenly became very interested in their dinner plates, and I caught sight of Emma's eyes widening in sympathy and secondhand embarrassment for what I was being subjected to in front of the entire family. Jessica, emboldened by my mother's public support and perhaps by her own wine consumption, didn't waste any time adding her own commentary. She tilted her head with that particular smirk I remembered from childhood, the expression she wore when she knew she had an audience and could say whatever she wanted without consequence. "Yeah, Sarah," she said with fake concern that fooled absolutely nobody at the table. "When are you going to stop playing around like you're still in college and actually get your life organized? You can't live in that cramped little apartment forever, bouncing from job to job, never putting down roots or making any real commitments. It's kind of sad, honestly." For a moment that stretched far longer than it should have, nobody said anything. Forks hovered halfway to mouths, wine glasses remained suspended in midair, and several people looked like they wanted to disappear entirely rather than witness this family drama playing out over Christmas dinner. Someone cleared their throat nervously, and I could practically feel Emma willing me to respond with something that would shut down this line of attack. It would have been so easy to revert to my childhood pattern, to laugh weakly, and make some self-deprecating joke that would deflect the attention away from me and back to safer territory. I could have mumbled something about how Jessica was absolutely right, that I was still figuring things out, that I admired what she had accomplished, and hoped to follow her example someday when I got my act together. But I wasn't that insecure girl anymore, and I had a house key in my purse that proved it. I set my fork down carefully, took a slow sip of wine to give myself a moment to choose my words, and looked directly at my mother with the kind of calm confidence I had never displayed at a family gathering before. I'm actually already settled, I said, my voice steady and clear enough for everyone at the table to hear without question. I just didn't invite anyone who constantly doubts my capabilities to see what I've built. My mother blinked several times in rapid succession, clearly taken off guard by my response, then let out a nervous laugh, like I had just made a joke that she didn't quite understand, but felt obligated to acknowledge anyway. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" she asked, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being overly dramatic. "Don't be silly. You're renting that tiny place in the city, barely making ends meet. That's not the same thing as what Jessica has accomplished here." I held her gaze steadily, feeling remarkably calm despite the fact that I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of their carefully constructed family narrative. "I'm not renting anything," I said with quiet certainty. "I bought my own house 8 months ago. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a home office, and a yard that overlooks Lake El Dorado. I paid for it in cash." The silence that descended over the table was so complete it felt almost solid, as if the air itself had thickened and become difficult to breathe. Someone's fork made a small clinking sound as it hit their plate, unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. My Aunt Helen's mouth actually fell open slightly, and my Uncle David stopped mid-chew, staring at me like I had just announced I was secretly a space alien. My mother's carefully arranged smile froze on her face for several seconds, before sliding off completely, replaced by an expression of confusion, and something that looked almost like betrayal, as if I had deliberately deceived her by not conforming to her expectations of my life. Jessica's reaction was swifter and more predictable. She let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor whatsoever, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. "Okay, sure," she said with obvious disbelief, leaning back in her chair and gesturing with her wine glass. "You bought a whole house in cash, Sarah. Come on. Nobody likes a liar, especially not on Christmas." Emma spoke up from across the table, her voice soft but absolutely firm, cutting through Jessica's dismissal with quiet authority. "She's not lying," she said, looking directly at Jessica before turning to address the rest of the family. "I've been there multiple times. It's real, and it's absolutely beautiful. She has a home office that overlooks the water, and the sunset views are incredible." Every head at the table swiveled toward Emma, then back to me, as if watching a tennis match played out in Family Revelations. My mother shook her head slowly, as if trying to process information that didn't fit with her understanding of reality. "Why would you buy a house and not tell your family?" she asked. And for the first time, I heard genuine hurt in her voice alongside the confusion. "Why would you keep something like that secret?" The question hung in the air, and I realized that this was my opportunity to either retreat back into politeness and avoid the real conversation, or to finally say everything I had been thinking for years. I chose honesty, because every time I tried to share anything meaningful about my life with you, you immediately changed the subject to Jessica's more interesting developments, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the emotional weight of what I was revealing. "You didn't want to hear about my college graduation, my promotions, my professional achievements, my financial stability. Why would you suddenly care about my house? This is absolutely ridiculous," my mother snapped, her voice rising with indignation. "Your sister has worked incredibly hard for everything she has. You could at least be happy for her instead of trying to steal her moment with some made-up story about a secret house." I felt something cold and sharp crystallize inside me, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop making excuses for other people's behavior and see it exactly as it is. I looked directly at Jessica, who was watching this exchange with growing discomfort as she began to realize that her moment of triumph was turning into something else entirely. "I am genuinely happy that you have a place to live," I said to her with complete sincerity. "What I'm not happy about is watching you pretend you accomplish this independently while you systematically drain Mom's retirement savings and max out credit cards like debt doesn't have real consequences." Jessica's face immediately flushed red, her confident expression replaced by something closer to panic. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice going up an octave. "You don't know anything about my financial situation. You're making things up now." "Actually, I know quite a bit," I replied calmly. "I overheard you two at the barbecue last month. 3 credit cards nearly maxed out, car payments you can barely afford, short $12,000 for closing costs, so Mom had to take another loan against her retirement account to make this purchase possible. I looked around the table at the uncomfortable faces of our relatives, most of whom were suddenly very interested in their dinner plates. I didn't go looking for that information. You were just discussing it loudly enough for anyone in the next room to hear. My mother's eyes widened as she realized what I had witnessed, and she glanced quickly at Jessica with an expression that mixed guilt with panic. The family financial arrangement they had been trying to keep private was now being discussed in front of everyone, and they both looked like they wanted to disappear. "That's none of your business," Jessica said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "What I discuss with Mom privately has nothing to do with you." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It became my business the moment Mom spent years telling me I needed to be financially independent and stand on my own 2 feet, while simultaneously lighting herself on fire financially to maintain your lifestyle and public image." I turned to address my mother directly, speaking more to her than to the rest of the table. "You told me repeatedly that I needed to learn responsibility, that asking for family help with my security deposit would prevent me from developing real independence. Meanwhile, you've been subsidizing Jessica's life for years, covering her mistakes, enabling her to avoid facing the consequences of her financial choices." My Aunt Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and my Uncle David cleared his throat nervously, clearly wishing he was anywhere else but witnessing this family confrontation. Someone muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath, though I couldn't tell who it was. My mother's voice became tight and defensive. "Sarah, that's enough," she said, with the tone she had used to end arguments when we were children. "You're ruining Christmas dinner." "No, Mom," I said quietly, but with absolute firmness. "You ruined Christmas dinner the moment you decided to use it as an opportunity to humiliate me publicly, while praising Jessica for achievements that were funded by your retirement savings. I'm just finally responding honestly, instead of pretending everything is fine." The silence stretched out again, heavy and uncomfortable, until Jessica leaned forward with her eyes narrowed, clearly deciding that attack was the best defense. "So you think you're better than me now?" she said, her voice dripping with resentment. "Because you claim to have some lake house and a job with an impressive title? You think that makes you superior?" I met her stare directly, feeling calmer than I had at any family gathering in my entire adult life. "No, Jessica," I said with quiet certainty. "I don't think I'm better than you. I think I finally stopped playing a rigged game where the rules change depending on who's competing. That's all." I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping against Jessica's expensive hardwood floors louder than I had intended. But I didn't apologize or try to soften the sound. I reached for my purse and stood up, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room focused on me. "Where do you think you're going?" my mother demanded, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority she had always used to keep me in line. "We're not finished discussing this." "Actually, I think we are completely finished," I replied, looking around the table at the collection of shocked and uncomfortable faces. "You made it clear years ago whose side you were on in this family. Tonight, I'm just making it clear that I'm finally on my own side." For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke, the dining room frozen in tableau like a pause in a dramatic play. Then Emma stood up as well, almost reflexively, as if her body had responded before her conscious mind had decided what to do. "I'll walk you out," she said simply, her voice cutting through the tension with quiet determination. We walked across the living room together, past the beautiful Christmas tree and the perfectly arranged furniture, while a dozen stunned family members sat in the dining room, trying to process what had just happened. As we stepped outside into the cold December air, the door closing behind us with a soft click, I felt the tension I had been carrying in my shoulders for years finally begin to release. The night air was sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation resuming behind us, probably everyone talking at once, trying to make sense of the revelations and accusations that had just exploded their understanding of our family dynamics. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, keys jingling in my hand, one thought settled in my mind with perfect clarity. For the first time in my entire life, I hadn't just survived a family gathering. I had fundamentally changed it. shifted the balance of power, refused to accept the role they had assigned me, and I felt absolutely no regret about finally telling the truth. In the weeks that followed that Christmas dinner, our family group chat fell into an unusual quiet that felt almost eerie after years of constant activity. Gone were my mother's enthusiastic all-caps messages about Jessica's latest purchases or career developments. Instead, there were awkward silences, sporadic forwarded memes that felt like desperate attempts to return to normal, and occasional tentative messages from various relatives asking if I was doing okay, in tones that suggested they weren't quite sure what the appropriate response was to my revelations. The only person who continued texting me as if nothing had changed was Emma. 3 days after Christmas, she sent me a message that made me smile for the first time since the dinner. "You know they're still talking about you, right? Mom said Uncle David called it the most epic mic drop in family history. You're basically a legend now, but also I think Aunt Patricia might be having an existential crisis." I was sitting in my home office when I read Emma's text, my laptop open to a freelance project for a tech startup in Boulder. My cat Lucy curled up on the window seat overlooking Lake El Dorado. The afternoon sun was hitting the water just right, creating sparkles that danced across the surface like scattered diamonds. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something approaching peace. A few days later, I decided to host Emma and her parents for a weekend at the lake house, partly because I wanted to show off my home, and partly because I needed to surround myself with family members who actually seemed to appreciate what I had built. They arrived on Friday evening with an absurd amount of luggage for a 2-day visit, Helen and David complaining about the cold, while simultaneously marveling at the view and the obvious quality of the renovation work. We spent the weekend cooking together in my spacious kitchen, taking long walks along the lake shore despite the winter weather, and playing board games at my dining table while snow fell gently outside the windows. It was the kind of peaceful, authentic family time I had always imagined but rarely experienced in my parents' house, where every gathering seemed to become a performance, designed to showcase Jessica's latest achievements. Sunday afternoon, as we were cleaning up after a breakfast of pancakes and bacon, Helen stood by my living room window looking out at the lake view that would be mine every morning for the rest of my life. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of regret I had never heard from her before. "Sarah," she said without turning around, "I owe you a sincere apology. I should have spoken up years ago when I saw how differently your mother treated you and Jessica. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, but that was just an excuse for taking the easy path instead of standing up for what was right." I joined her at the window, both of us watching a pair of ducks paddle across the calm water. "You see it clearly now," I said, and I meant it without any bitterness. That's what matters going forward. As winter gradually gave way to spring, news about Jessica and my mother reached me in fragments, mostly through Emma's updates and occasional phone calls from relatives who seemed to feel obligated to keep me informed about family developments. The picture that emerged was not particularly surprising, but it was sobering in its predictability. The credit card debt that Jessica had been juggling for months finally reached a tipping point where even minimum payments became unmanageable. The promotion at work that she had been counting on to solve her financial problems never materialized, partly because her performance had declined under the stress of constant money worries, and partly because the retail industry was undergoing major changes that eliminated many management positions. A few months after our Christmas confrontation, Jessica's company went through a round of layoffs designed to cut costs and streamline operations. As one of the newer employees with a less than stellar attendance record, she was among the first to be let go, receiving a small severance package that barely covered her expenses for 2 weeks. Without steady employment, the beautiful house that had been the centerpiece of our family's Christmas celebration became an unsustainable financial burden. Jessica and my mother tried to maintain the mortgage payments for several months, cobbling together money from unemployment benefits, my mother's remaining savings, and increasingly desperate measures like cash advances on credit cards that carried interest rates approaching 30%. But the mathematics of their situation were unforgiving. Jessica's unemployment benefits covered less than half of her monthly expenses. My mother's retirement savings had been depleted by years of subsidizing Jessica's lifestyle, and the debt they had accumulated was growing faster than they could possibly pay it down. Eventually, after several missed mortgage payments and increasingly urgent notices from the bank, Jessica made the decision to put the house on the market. The dream home that had earned her such glowing praise just months earlier was sold to pay back creditors and settle some of the debt she had accumulated in her attempts to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. My mother, Patricia, began calling me with increasing frequency as their financial situation deteriorated. At first, the voicemails were angry and accusatory, blaming me for somehow causing Jessica's problems by revealing their private financial arrangements at Christmas dinner. "How could you humiliate your sister like that in front of the entire family?" she demanded in one particularly emotional message. "She's struggling enough without having to deal with everyone knowing about her private business." But as the weeks passed and their situation became more desperate, the tone of her messages shifted from anger to bargaining to outright pleading. "We're still family," she would say, her voice breaking with emotion. "Your sister needs help, and you're in a position to provide it now. You have money. You have stability. You could help her get back on her feet, just temporarily, just until she finds another job and gets things sorted out." Buried in these increasingly desperate voicemails, I began to hear something I had thought I would never hear from my mother: genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," she said in one message that I listened to multiple times, sitting on my deck with the lake stretching out in front of me. "I didn't realize how much I had hurt you over the years. I thought I was just trying to help Jessica succeed, but I see now that I wasn't being fair to you." I listened to every message she left, processing each one carefully while walking along the lake shore or sitting in my home office with Lucy purring in my lap. And gradually, I came to an important realization about apologies and forgiveness that would shape how I handled this situation going forward. An apology, no matter how sincere, doesn't erase the years you spent diminishing yourself to fit inside someone else's narrative. It doesn't magically undo the damage done by decades of favoritism, financial inequality, and emotional neglect. And most importantly, accepting an apology doesn't obligate you to return to patterns of behavior that were harmful to your well-being and financial security. So I called my mother one final time, choosing my words carefully as I explained my position. "Mom, I'm genuinely glad that you're starting to understand what happened between us over the years," I said, watching the sun set over the lake as I spoke. "I really am grateful for that recognition, and I hope it helps you build better relationships going forward." I paused, choosing my next words with particular care. "But I spent my entire childhood and young adulthood being the daughter you overlooked, the one you expected to sacrifice so that Jessica could shine brighter. I'm not going to return to that role now, even in the name of family loyalty or emergency assistance." I took a deep breath before delivering the hardest part of my message. I'm not going to use my financial stability to fix problems that were created by years of enabling poor decisions. I love both of you, but I'm done being the family member who's expected to solve problems she didn't create. After that conversation, I set boundaries that I had never imagined having the strength to maintain. Fewer phone calls, no discussions about money or Jessica's career prospects, no guilt trips about my obligations to family members who were struggling. When those boundaries were repeatedly tested and ignored, I took steps I had never thought I would need to take. Blocking phone numbers, muting group chats, choosing my own peace of mind over their version of family loyalty. Instead of pouring my emotional energy into family drama and financial rescue missions, I channeled it into my work, my friendships, and a new project that gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. I began volunteering at a local women's resource center, helping women who felt trapped by family expectations or financial dependence develop practical strategies for building independence. The work involved teaching basic financial literacy, how to create budgets, build emergency funds, and plan for long-term financial security. I also helped with resume writing, job interview preparation, and basic digital marketing skills that could be used to develop side businesses or freelance income. But the most meaningful part of the work was simply listening to their stories and helping them see possibilities they hadn't considered before. Sitting across from women who had been told their entire lives that they weren't capable of financial independence, hearing their stories of family dynamics that prioritized other people's needs over their own, I recognized pieces of my own journey reflected back at me. Many of them had been the responsible daughters, the ones everyone assumed would be fine, the ones whose struggles were invisible because they didn't make noise or demand attention. Working with these women reminded me that being the overlooked child, the one who has to fight for recognition and support, often develops skills and resilience that become tremendous assets later in life. The ability to work independently, to solve problems creatively, to build something meaningful without external validation. These are not weaknesses to be pitied, but strengths to be celebrated. If there's any lesson in what happened to me, it's this. Being the invisible child doesn't mean you're powerless or destined for failure. Sometimes it means you're the one quietly developing the skills and determination needed to build a life that's genuinely your own, free from other people's expectations and limitations. Parents can play favorites, and siblings can monopolize attention and resources. But at the end of the day, the only person who truly lives with the consequences of your choices is you. You're allowed to set boundaries, even with family members. You're allowed to say no to financial requests that would compromise your own security. You're allowed to build something they never saw coming and protect it from people who doubt your capabilities. If you grew up feeling like a supporting character in your own family's story, I hope my experience reminds you that you have the power to write a different narrative. You can choose to prioritize your own well-being and goals, even if it makes other people uncomfortable or forces them to confront their own choices. And if you've ever had the difficult experience of stepping away from family relationships that were damaging to your sense of self-worth, know that you're not alone. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for them, is to stop enabling destructive patterns and start modeling what healthy boundaries actually look like. The lake is peaceful this morning as I write this, the surface reflecting the early sunrise like a mirror. Lucy is curled up on her favorite cushion, and I have a full day of work ahead of me on projects that challenge and fulfill me in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was that insecure girl, desperately hoping for family approval. I built this life one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one small act of courage at a time. And while it wasn't the family story I had originally hoped for, it's become something much more valuable. A life that's authentically mine, built on my own terms, strong enough to weather any storm.